The washing machine broke on the worst possible day. It was a dull, gray Friday, the sky low and heavy with clouds, and everything since morning had felt slightly off, as if the house itself was in a bad mood. Maggie Hollis's apartment had that particular half-light you get in late winter, just before real spring arrives. Most of the snow had already melted, but the light outside was still cold and unwelcoming, and even her freshly mopped floors looked dull. On the kitchen counter, tea grew cold in a cup with a thin gold rim. Folded towels lay neatly on the windowsill, and through the half-open bathroom door, the washing machine stood silent, heavy, helpless, and broken. Just yesterday it had worked without complaint. Maggie did not call her daughter right away. She did not want to disturb anyone. At 62, she was still a composed woman, used to handling small household problems without fuss. She knew how to keep her back straight even when her heart ached, and how to speak calmly even when she felt uneasy inside. But this time, it was not just about the machine. The washer had stopped with a sharp click. The water had not drained and the laundry was still inside. And along with that silly breakdown, something else seemed to freeze in the apartment. A long accumulation of tiredness, a gathered silence, too many evenings spent alone. Her daughter Rachel was on shift. Her son-in-law Dan answered almost immediately. "I will stop by after work," he said, short and confidently. "I will take a look." She thanked him the way you thank someone for ordinary household help, but after putting the phone down, she did not move it from the table right away. She sat still for a few seconds, looking out the window at the bare branches of the poplar tree in the yard. She did not like her own restlessness. It felt out of place, unnecessary, almost insulting. Dan was her daughter's husband, a member of the family, practically a son, as the neighbors said. And yet, in recent months, she had often felt a strange caution around him, as if she needed to watch not just her words, but also the pauses between them. He arrived in the evening, when the streetlights had already come on in the yard, and the stairwell smelled of someone's cooking. Fried onions, bread, something with meat. Dan walked in with his tools in his hands, tall, a little tired, wearing a dark jacket, with that restrained focus that always suited him. He greeted her warmly but without too much closeness, and for some reason that made Maggie feel even more awkward. She noticed how he quickly took off his shoes, placed them neatly against the wall, and rolled up his shirt sleeves before heading to the bathroom. Everything about him was simple and reliable in a masculine way, and it was precisely that reliability that troubled her the most. He spent a long time working on the machine, crouching down, removing the back panel, checking the hose and the filter, muttering something quietly to himself. Maggie first stood in the doorway, then went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, took out some cookies, but she could not shake the feeling that the apartment had become too quiet. Even the sounds of his work, light metallic noises, the rustle of tools, the splash of water, did not break that silence. It pressed in from all sides, heavy and full of things left unsaid. When Dan came out to the kitchen to wash his hands, something almost happened between them that would later stay on her mind for a long time. She handed him a towel and his fingers accidentally brushed against her palm. It was very brief, almost unnoticeable, but for some reason they both looked away immediately. Dan muttered something, and Maggie, a moment late, seemed to realize what had just occurred. The awkwardness from that tiny accident was so strong that she quickly started talking about something trivial. Prices, the weather, the neighbor on the 5th floor who kept complaining about the pipes. He answered, but distractedly, as if he was thinking about something else. Later, when they were sitting in the kitchen with tea, Dan said the machine would probably work again, but he would need to check the pump. He spoke calmly, looking not at her, but at the table, and that restraint suddenly became more unsettling than any direct words. Maggie looked at his tired face, the shadows under his eyes, his strong hands resting next to his cup, and she suddenly realized she had not been this close to a man in a long time. In ordinary home silence, without rush, without guests, without her daughter between them. Maybe that was why she said something she had not meant to say. At first, very quietly, almost indistinctly. The hardest thing that broke in this house is not the washing machine. Dan looked up, and after a short pause that made her mouth go dry, Maggie said more clearly, "The silence here has become unbearable. And when you are here, for some reason, it is even harder to pretend that everything is fine." He froze, not touching his tea. In the kitchen, only the sound of the neighbor's television could be heard through the wall. Then Dan slowly straightened up and said one sentence, after which their usual household help could never be the same again. I thought I was the only one who found it too hard to keep quiet in here. After those words, the kitchen became so quiet that even the old clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than usual. Maggie slowly put her cup down on the table. She had not expected that answer. Her own words from a few seconds ago were still ringing in her head. Too honest, too careless. She did not understand why she had let them out. Maybe because no one had spoken truly in this house for a long time. Everything was proper, calm, familiar, but somehow without air. Dan sat across from her and looked somewhere past her, toward the window. Outside, a rare evening snow was falling, and the yard was lit by yellow streetlights. His face was tense, as if he himself was surprised by what he had said. He slowly ran a hand through his hair and added quietly, "I am sorry. I probably did not express that well." But Maggie suddenly felt that it was too late to back away. She looked at him carefully. Over the years, she had grown used to seeing him first and foremost as her daughter's husband, the man who came to holidays, helped move furniture, sometimes fixed outlets or faucets. He was part of the family, but he always stayed a little on the side, as men often do, calm, quiet. But now the person sitting across from her was not just her son-in-law. He was a tired man who, it seemed, was also struggling. "You expressed it correctly," she said quietly. He finally looked at her. That look lasted only a second, but there was too much in it that had never been between them before. Awkwardness, caution, and some strange understanding. Maggie looked away first. She suddenly felt that the kitchen had become stuffy, as if the air had grown heavier. She smiled weakly, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. Probably old age. When a person is left alone, the house starts to sound different. Dan was silent. He carefully took his cup, took a sip, but put it down almost immediately. "You are not alone," he said. She gave a quiet, dry laugh. "That is what you think? You have work, a family. I have long evenings." He wanted to say something but stopped. The pause stretched. In the apartment, they could hear water suddenly gurgling softly in the bathroom. The machine apparently was finally draining the remaining water. That sound was unexpectedly loud in the silence. Maggie stood up. "I will go check." She went to the bathroom, but really she just needed a few seconds alone. Her heart was beating faster than usual for no good reason. The machine was indeed working now, quietly, carefully, as if recovering from a long illness. She stood in front of it and watched the drum turn slowly. In the mirror above the sink, she saw her own reflection. Her face was calm, as always. Her hair was neatly styled, the same posture she had kept her whole life. But there was something else in her eyes, a slight unease she had not seen in herself for a long time. She suddenly understood one simple thing clearly. This evening had changed something between them, even if nothing more was ever said. When she returned to the kitchen, Dan was standing by the window. He was looking down into the yard. The streetlight fell on his face from the side, making his expression look especially thoughtful. "It is working," she said calmly. He turned around. "Good." They stood in silence for a few moments. Then Dan said, "You know, lately I have been thinking a lot about how strange things are arranged." "What do you mean?" she asked. He shrugged slightly. "People live next to each other for years, see each other on holidays, talk, help each other, but in reality they hardly know anything about one another." Those words sounded unexpectedly serious. Maggie slowly sat back down at the table. "Maybe because it is safer that way," she said quietly. "When you do not know too much." Dan smiled, but there was no joy in it. "And what if you suddenly find out?" She looked at him more carefully. "Then life becomes harder," she answered. He was silent. At that moment, the kitchen became especially quiet. The clock on the wall showed almost 10 in the evening. Dan suddenly glanced at his phone. "It is late. I should probably go." Those words came out too quickly. Maggie nodded. "Of course." He picked up his jacket but did not put it on right away, as if he wanted to say something but could not decide. She stood next to the table. There were only a few steps between them, and then another accidental movement happened. He bent down to get his tools, and she wanted to help and also reached out. Again, their fingers met for a second. But this time, no one pulled away immediately. They just froze. 1 second. 2. Then Dan quietly pulled his hand back and straightened up quickly. "Sorry," he said too fast. Maggie felt something tighten inside her. she suddenly realized that this evening was not over yet, and the strangest thing was that she did not want it to end. Dan was already at the door when he unexpectedly stopped. He turned to her and said quietly, almost carefully, "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him in surprise. "What?" He was silent for a few seconds, then said a sentence that made the air in the apartment heavy again. "Tell me honestly, did you say what you said about the silence in this house only because of loneliness?" And Maggie suddenly understood that the answer to this question could change everything. The question hung in the air, as if Dan had spoken it too loudly for such a quiet kitchen. Maggie did not answer right away. She stood next to the table, leaning slightly on the edge of the tablecloth, and looked at him carefully, almost studying him. The words he had just said were simple, but behind them, there was too much of what people usually do not talk about in a family. Dan stood by the door. His jacket was still in his hands. He looked like he had already decided to leave, but something kept him there. There was no boldness in his gaze, more worry and expectation. Maggie slowly exhaled. "Why are you asking?" she said quietly. He shrugged a little but did not answer immediately. He paused. "Sometimes it feels like it is not just about loneliness." Those words came out carefully, almost guiltily. She felt something tighten inside her for a moment. How many years had she lived, always trying to keep herself under control? How many times had she told her daughter that the most important thing in life was calm and family order? And now, this young man, who had entered their home as a son-in-law, stood in front of her asking questions that were not meant to be answered. Maggie walked to the window. The yard was almost empty. Only an old sedan slowly pulled out of the parking lot, its tires crunching on the remaining snow. She looked at that ordinary yard, at the dim streetlights, at the familiar doorways, and suddenly felt tired of pretending. "You are a good person, Dan," she said quietly. "That is why I do not want to lie to you." He said nothing. She turned around. He was still standing by the door, but now his gaze had become more tense. Loneliness is part of the truth, but not all of it. In the kitchen, another pause followed. Dan slowly put his tools on the shelf near the door, as if he understood that the conversation was not over yet. "Then what else?" he asked. Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "A strange feeling," she said, "when you realize that the years are passing, but inside you there is still something alive that you thought had disappeared long ago." He listened carefully. "What kind of feeling?" he asked cautiously. She looked straight at him. "A human one," she answered. "Simple things. The desire to talk, to feel that someone is listening." Dan ran a hand over his face as if trying to gather his thoughts. "But you have a daughter, a family." Maggie laughed softly. "Family is when people live next to each other. Closeness is when they truly hear each other." He lowered his eyes. There was no accusation in her words, but there was a truth that was hard to ignore. After a few seconds, Dan said, "You know, sometimes I think you understand me better than she does." That sentence came out unexpectedly. Maggie even flinched slightly. "Do not say that," she said gently. "She is your wife." "I know." He answered immediately, but his voice was flat. He stopped, choosing his words. "It is just, sometimes people start living together, but stop talking." She looked at him for a long time. There was something familiar in his face, the same tiredness she sometimes saw in the mirror. "So you are both silent," she said quietly. He slowly nodded. The words they were speaking were cautious, but between them, there had already appeared that dangerous sense of understanding that can connect people more strongly than years of shared life. Maggie felt the conversation was going too far. She stood up. "It is late, Dan." He understood as well. "Yes." He picked up his jacket and started putting it on, but when he reached the door, she suddenly said, "Wait." He stopped. She came closer. There were only a few steps between them again. She looked at him calmly, but there was something new in her gaze, a soft seriousness. "We need to be careful," she said. "I understand," he answered quietly, "because sometimes people start talking to each other too honestly." He nodded. "And then they cannot pretend that nothing is happening." For a few seconds, they simply stood next to each other without words. There was more tension in that pause than in the entire conversation. Dan finally opened the door. Cold air from the hallway entered the apartment. He had already stepped over the threshold when he suddenly turned around and said quietly, "Maggie, Can I say one thing? She frowned slightly. What? He looked at her for a few seconds, as if making up his mind, and then spoke words that made her heart unexpectedly skip a beat. Sometimes I think that if we had met 20 years ago, everything might have turned out very differently. Having said that, he stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door to close slowly behind him. The door closed quietly, but in the apartment that sound came out unexpectedly loud, as if it had put a period on a conversation that in reality had only just begun. Maggie stood still in the entryway for a few more seconds, not moving. Outside, Dan's footsteps slowly faded down the stairs. First he went down one flight, then another, then everything went quiet. She did not go to the window to watch him leave the building. She did not turn on the television as she usually did in the evenings. She simply went back to the kitchen and sat down on the same chair where he had sat not long ago. His cup remained on the table. The tea was barely touched. She mechanically pushed it a little closer to herself and only then realized that her hands were slightly trembling. The words Dan had said before leaving were not rude, not even especially intimate, but there was in them that dangerous honesty that cannot simply be forgotten. If we had met 20 years ago, Maggie slowly closed her eyes. 20 years ago, she had been a completely different woman. Younger, lighter on her feet, laughing more. Her husband had still been alive then. Life had still seemed long and clear. Now the past sounded almost like someone else's story. In the kitchen, it became quiet again. Only the washing machine in the bathroom hummed softly, finishing its cycle. Maggie stood up and turned off the light. The evening dragged on slowly. She did not go to bed for a long time. She walked around the apartment, folding things, wiping the table, checking if the balcony door was locked, doing all the things people do when they are trying to occupy their thoughts with anything. But her thoughts kept returning to the same thing. His look, his voice, that awkward pause when their hands had met again. She could not understand what exactly had changed between them today. Nothing had happened on the outside, not one unnecessary word, not one step that could be called wrong. And yet something restless had settled inside her, as if an invisible line had appeared between them that they both had noticed but were not yet ready to name. She went to bed long after midnight, but sleep did not come easily, and when it finally came, it was restless. The next day was sunny. That rare early spring light filled the yard, and the snow on the asphalt had almost completely melted. Maggie woke up early, as always. She made coffee, opened the kitchen window to let in the cold morning air, and suddenly caught herself thinking a strange thought. Today she was waiting for him to call. That was silly. There was no reason for a call, the washing machine was working, no more help was needed, and yet, somewhere inside, she was waiting. An hour passed, then another. The phone stayed silent. She even felt relieved. That is how it should be, she thought. Last night's conversation was just an accident. Sometimes people say too much when they are tired. But closer to noon, the phone finally rang. On the screen was her daughter's name. Maggie answered right away. "Hi, Mom," Emily said cheerfully. "Dan stopped by yesterday, fixed everything." Maggie felt something tighten slightly inside her. "Yes, it is working now. I told him you get worried when appliances break." She smiled. Nothing serious. The conversation was ordinary, calm, groceries, weather, plans for the weekend. But one sentence from her daughter made Maggie pause for a second. "By the way," Emily said, "he came home late yesterday. He was acting strange. Hardly said a word all evening." Maggie said nothing. She just listened. "Probably tired from work," Emily continued. "I asked if everything was okay. He said, 'Yes, just a long day.'" After the call, Maggie sat in the kitchen for a long time. Now she knew for sure. Last night's conversation had stayed with him too. In the evening, she went out into the yard just to walk. The sun was already setting, the air was cool, and as she was returning to her building, she suddenly noticed a familiar figure by a car. Dan was standing next to his vehicle. He had not noticed her at first. He was just standing there, leaning against the car door, looking somewhere toward the entrance, as if he was waiting for someone. When he finally saw her, their eyes met. And at that moment, Maggie suddenly understood one troubling thing. He had not come here because of the washing machine. Dan took a few steps toward her and said quietly, "I was hoping I would run into you." She stopped. "Why?" He was silent for a few seconds. then said something that turned her calm evening into something else entirely. Because yesterday, I did not say everything. The evening yard was almost empty. Dusk slowly settled between the buildings. The streetlights had just begun to turn on, and long shadows from the few passersby stretched across the asphalt. Somewhere behind the building, a door slammed loudly, a car drove by, and then it was quiet again. Maggie stopped a few steps away from Dan. His words were still in her head. Because yesterday I did not say everything. She felt the familiar unease rise inside her, the same one that had appeared last night in the kitchen. Not everything? She asked calmly. He nodded but did not speak right away. Dan looked unusually serious, not the way he usually did at family dinners, calm, a little humorous, restrained. Now there was some internal struggle on his face. He seemed unsure himself whether he should continue. Maggie looked around. The yard was quiet, but the windows of the buildings were already lighting up, and she suddenly felt that fear she had mentioned the night before. The fear of other people's looks, casual gossip, neighbors' guesses. Dan, she said gently, this kind of conversation is better not to have in the yard. He understood immediately. Let us walk. She thought for a moment, then nodded. They walked slowly along the building toward a small path lined with bare trees. This was where older people usually walked during the day and a few passersby in the evening. Now there was almost no one. They walked in silence. Maggie heard the wet snow crunching softly under her feet. Dan walked beside her, a little ahead, as if gathering his thoughts. Finally he stopped. I should not have come, he said quietly. She looked at him. Then why did you? He slowly exhaled. Because yesterday you said what I have been feeling for a long time. Those words sounded simple but heavy. Maggie looked down. She understood where this conversation was heading, and that was exactly why she wanted to stop it. Dan, she began, but he shook his head gently. No, let me finish. She fell silent. He stood across from her, slightly hunched, as if from tiredness. I am not talking about anything wrong, he said quietly. Do not misunderstand me. It is just that sometimes a person needs to tell the truth at least once. She listened. When I come to your place, he continued, it is calm. Do you understand? You listen. You do not argue. It is easy to talk to you. She felt her heart begin to beat faster. And at home? She asked quietly. He smiled bitterly. At home, everything is fine. It is just that Emily and I have been living as if we are on a schedule for a long time. Those words came out without anger, more with tiredness. Maggie felt an unpleasant sensation in her chest. That is life, Dan, she said gently. Many people live like that. I know. He looked up. But yesterday you talked about the silence in the house, and I suddenly understood that I feel the same thing. They fell silent again. The wind gently shook the bare branches above the path. Maggie said, Do you know what is the most dangerous thing about conversations like this? He looked at her. What? She did not answer right away. When two people start understanding each other too well, he looked at her for a long time. Is that bad? She slowly shook her head. It is wonderful, but sometimes it is also destructive. He looked away. For a few seconds, they just stood there. Then Dan said quietly, I do not want to destroy your family. Those words came out unexpectedly firm. Maggie felt a strange relief. Then why say any of this? He looked at her with a slight sadness. Because if we keep being silent, it will be even worse. She understood. Yes, sometimes the truth really is easier than silence, but the truth can also be more dangerous. She took a deep breath. Dan, listen to me carefully. He nodded. We are both adults. We both understand what is happening. He said nothing. But there are things you cannot allow yourself to feel for too long. He asked quietly, even if they have already appeared? She closed her eyes for a second. Especially then. He looked at her for a long time, then said slowly, So you feel it too. Maggie did not answer, and her silence was an answer. A few seconds passed. Dan said quietly, Then maybe I should not come here anymore. Those words stung unexpectedly, but she understood. That was the only reasonable way. That is probably the right thing to do, she said quietly. He nodded, but before turning toward his car, he added, Just one more thing. She looked up. He looked at her very calmly and said a sentence that would stay in her memory for a long time. Sometimes the most important feelings in life come too late. After those words, he got into the car. The engine started. The headlights lit up the empty path for a second, and Maggie stood there and suddenly understood one terribly simple thing. She was not sure she could simply go home and live the way she had before. The car's headlights lit up the path for a moment, then slowly turned toward the exit from the yard. The sound of the engine gradually faded into the evening quiet, and the yard became as peaceful as always. Maggie stood there for a while longer. The cold air touched her face, but she barely felt it. Dan's last words were still in her head. Sometimes the most important feelings in life come too late. She walked slowly toward her building. Her steps felt heavier than usual. Inside, everything was strangely quiet, as if the apartment itself knew in advance that its owner would return different. When she opened the door, the entryway smelled familiar, of cleanliness, a little laundry detergent, and a faint trace of tea. The washing machine stood quietly in the bathroom, working properly. She mechanically turned on the kitchen light and sat down at the table. The chair creaked the same way it had the night before, but now everything seemed slightly different. Maggie looked for a long time at the countertop, at the neatly folded tablecloth, at the cup she had forgotten to put away after her morning coffee. There had been so many years in her life, so many ordinary days that each one seemed almost the same. And suddenly, among those ordinary days, there was one evening that turned everything around. Not on the outside, but on the inside. She felt neither joy nor fear, just a quiet sadness, that mature, calm sadness that comes to a person along with an understanding of life. She knew perfectly well that Dan was right. Some feelings really do come too late, but that does not mean they have to change everything around her. She slowly stood up and walked to the window. The yard was quiet, someone was walking a dog at the other end of the building, and a few passersby were hurrying toward their entrances. An ordinary evening, an ordinary life. And yet something inside her had already changed. She remembered something her husband had said many years ago. He had said it calmly when they were discussing life, already not young. The main thing is not to destroy what keeps people together. At the time, she had not attached much importance to those words. Now she understood. Some things have to be preserved at any cost, even if that means staying silent. She closed the window quietly. The phone on the table vibrated unexpectedly. Maggie flinched. On the screen was a message from Dan. She looked at the screen for a few seconds, not opening it. Then she finally pressed it. The message was short. "Thank you for your honesty. I will try not to put you in a difficult position again. And forgive me for tonight's conversation." She looked at those lines for a long time, then slowly typed a reply. Her fingers moved calmly, without hurry. "Do not apologize. Sometimes people just need to tell the truth. But now, we both know what to do." The reply came almost immediately. "Yes, protect the family," Maggie quietly exhaled. She put the phone aside and suddenly felt an unexpected relief. Not because the conversation was over, but because they had both made the right decision. She sat in the kitchen for a while longer, listening to the nighttime quiet of the apartment. Now that silence no longer felt as heavy as it had the night before. Sometimes one honest conversation is enough for a person to understand themselves, even if that conversation changes nothing on the outside. The next day, she met her daughter. They sat at the same kitchen table, drank tea, talked about work, shopping, neighbors, the most ordinary things. Emily laughed, told some stories, and Maggie suddenly looked at her differently, more warmly, more gently. She understood that life sometimes places a person in front of quiet, almost invisible tests that no one sees. But it is in those moments that it is decided what kind of person you remain. In the evening, Maggie sat by the window again. A rare early spring snow fell slowly in the yard. She watched it calmly. Somewhere in the city, Dan's car was driving. He was going home to his family, and that was right. Some feelings remain in life only as quiet memory, as an unfinished conversation, as a brief spring that comes for a moment and then leaves. But it is precisely those moments that sometimes remind a person that their heart is still alive. And perhaps that too has its own quiet, grown-up truth.